Hi and welcome to the tutorial for InstaMask in CS6. The first thing you'll notice is that InstaMask looks different for CS6 than the one for CC. Most notably, the sliders here in CC don't exist in CS6. However, we do have the same function, but it's under the slider adjust button. So very quickly, if I create a luminosity mask through InstaMask, I can press slider adjust, and that will allow us to adjust the mask any way we want. So we still have the function there, we just don't have the sliders. There are some functions that don't exist in the InstaMask for CS6 version because the functions don't exist in CC. For example, in the RGB Masks button here, you can see we have the RGB masks, but we don't have the range masks that we have in InstaMask for CC because the range mask options weren't created until Photoshop CC, so they don't exist in CS6 sadly. But fortunately we do have the vast majority of functions in InstaMask CS6 that we have in the CC version. So we can still do a great job of exposure blending and making fine changes to our workflow. So let me show you quickly the logic or the structure of InstaMask. It's set out in 4 different sections. So we have a top section here, and then our second section is devoted to creating masks. So we can press these buttons and create our luminosity masks. Now we do have 2 other options here. Color mask, which allows us to make specific selections to color, and edge mask, which helps us to create fine selections of edges. But with the exception of these 2 buttons, everything that we need to create our luminosity masks is in here. And of course we have this RGB button, which allows us to open up our RGB channel, which we'll talk about later. Now let me show you a very basic InstaMask workflow. Now to delete InstaMask, we simply press del-IM, and that deletes our InstaMask. Now I want to show you how we can create a mask and apply it to a layer. So the first thing I'm going to do is hide this dark layer which I have on top, and I want to blend this dark layer into this base exposure, this brighter layer. So I want to take the sky from the dark exposure and put it in to this brighter exposure. And I also want to put the water in there too. So I simply create a Brights 1 mask. And this creates a general selection of the highlights in the sky. If I choose a Brights 5 mask, that creates a more restrictive selection, which isn't very good in this example. So let's choose a Brights 1 mask. Now, if we want to adjust that mask, we can go to slider adjust and maybe make it a little bit more contrasting, just so we're selecting more of the sky, and press OK. Then if we're happy with the mask, we just click on the layer that we wish to apply the mask to, then we press apply. And now we can press show layer. And so we've blended these 2 exposures. But let me take this a step further. I'm going to delete that mask and I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to hide this layer. I'm going to create a Brights 1 mask. But this time I want to take all of the water from the darker exposure and put that into the base exposure, because previously the blend wasn't very good. So to do that, I can choose a black brush. Now you see we've got this option here, which is brush. So I can choose it, and I can choose black as my foreground, and I can press LA, which makes a large brush of 2000 pixels. And now I have a plus sign or a minus sign, which will make our brush bigger or smaller. Now on CS6, this doesn't happen on CC, but on CS6, when we press this the first time, it might take a few seconds to load. And you might see a little pop-up here like this. And now we've increased our brush size to 250. So it increases the brush size by 250 each time. But now we've done that once, we can press the plus or minus and it happens very quickly. So now I've got a large paintbrush. I'm actually going to change my foreground color to white. And I'm just going to paint in this area here. And now again, I can select the layer I wish to apply the mask to and just press apply. And so I can show that layer. And now we have a much more natural blend because the water should be a little bit darker than the sky. So essentially what I did was, even though I was generating masks and applying the masks, during that process, I can edit the mask any way I want manually. So you're not limited just to the masks that we create. So now let me take you through some of the buttons in the panel and what they do. Well, we've already looked at hide. We know that hides the existing layer and that shows the existing layer. If I hide it and choose a Brights 1, we can press this C RGB channel to show us the big color picture in front of us. And we can press the mask button to show us the InstaMask. So we need to have InstaMask created to do this. Align simply means when we have multiple exposures, and let's say we've shot handheld rather than with a tripod, and there's some difference between exposures, they're not aligned. We can press this and it will use Photoshop's native align function to align the layers. This doesn't work with smart objects, just rasterized layers. Del IM deletes the InstaMask layer. And now if we go to deselect, for example, this will deselect any active selection that we have. So if we press the select button here, we now have an active selection. But what if we want to deselect that selection? Well, we can just press this button and now we have no selection. ACR opens Adobe Camera Raw, but we can only use it if we already opened our images through Adobe Camera Raw as smart objects. So for example, let's go to this image here. It's not a smart object, it's just a normal rasterized layer. If we press ACR, we get an error. And it doesn't work if we convert this layer to a smart object without opening it in Adobe Camera Raw. So if I press that, we're just going to get a duplicate of that image. So it didn't work. But if you opened up your image in Adobe Camera Raw and before you pressed Open Image, you held down Shift, you'll see an option called Open Object. And this opens your image as a smart object directly from Adobe Camera Raw. So if I press ACR now, we open up Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm going to cancel that. Now, all LMs will allow you to create all your luminosity masks. I don't find this particularly useful, but some users might. So if I press all LMs, now you'll see we have the full selection of 16-bit luminosity masks. And so you can cycle through them like that and see which one's best for you. Again, I don't think this is any better than using the buttons along here, but some people might find it useful. When you're finished, simply press Delete Luminosity Masks or Del LMs. Black M creates a black mask, white M creates a white mask. So we can press this button without removing any existing mask. I'm going to delete that mask. Now let's go down to these masks here. If we press R, that creates a particular mask, which selects more of the red tones in the image, and green will select more of the green. And so we can cycle through these masks to see which suits us. But you'll notice that our InstaMask is a blank mask. It doesn't have anything on it yet. If we're happy with the selection, we have to press OK. And now we create our InstaMask. Or if we want to make a manual selection, we can press All. We can open up this layer here and we can bring along the sliders as we see fit. And you see we can make our own selection. Now I try not to be particularly strong with this because it can cause banding. But again, once you've finished, we can press OK and we've created our InstaMask. Now hide ants hides your marching ants if you have an active selection. So if I press Select, we have an active selection. I can press Hide Ants. The selection is still there, it's just not visible. So if I open, let's say, a curves layer, you can see we have that selection applied to that curves layer. Now a color mask, again, this will allow us to generate our masks based on color, so we can select an area in our image. Now, the best way to do this is to go to Selection Preview and Grayscale. So you get a perfect view of what your mask will look like. And you can select any color you want. We can bring up the fuzziness to make it more general, or you can press this plus button and that will add colors to the selection. Or you can press this minus and that will subtract colors from the selection. And when you're done, you just press OK. Another option is to use an edge mask. So this will allow us to select the edges in our image. And this can be great if we're sharpening, for example, and sometimes we get white edging in our image. So I'm going to show you an example of that. First of all, I'm going to make a more contrasting scene. So we want the bigger edges to be nice and strong, but the smaller edges not to be black. We want them to be white. So we want roughly this sort of look. Then we can press OK, and now we want to blur that selection slightly so it's not too strong. So let's say I'm going to go to 4 pixels. And now we have our mask. Now I can actually use the slider adjust here to make those thicker edges even darker after we've used the blur function. And then I press OK. And now I can press, say, for example, sharpen. I'm going to zoom into this area and I'm going to sharpen it so that we get some white edging. I'm going to make it really strong and really exaggerated. And I'm going to press Okay. Now, if I zoom in to the tops of these buildings, let's say, now you can see we have almost no white edging. There is a little bit of white edging because the sharpening was really strong. But if I get rid of this mask, watch, disable layer mask, you see the edging becomes much stronger. So this is with the mask disabled, and this is with the mask enabled. You see it removes that strong white edging. Now naturally you won't want to sharpen as strong as that, so combined with an edge mask, you could come out with a very sharp image without white edging. Now I'm just going to delete that layer. Now before we move on, I want to show you what the RGB Masks panel does. So I'm going to go to this image here, and I'm going to press this RGB button. And here is our RGB Masks panel. This creates the same luminosity masks that we have here, but those masks are based purely on our channels, our red, green and blue channels. So for example, if I choose, let's say a Brights 3, I want to target just the stars, and that's given us a pretty good selection. But if I go to, let's say, Reds 3, that's given us a slightly better selection. Greens 3, that's given us an even better selection of the stars. But if I go to Blue 3, that's given us an amazing selection of the stars, mainly because our image, if we look at it, is blue. So now if I want to say add contrast to the stars, I can press curves. That creates a curves layer, and now I can create contrast in the stars. So the RGB channel allows us to create masks based on all those channels and to give us different selections. Another example of that is if we go back to this image and I hide this layer. If I make a Brights 1 mask, the goal here is to create a selection of the sky separate to the foreground. If we press the red channel Brights 1, you'll see we haven't done that. It's a much more general selection and the foreground's included. But if I go to the blue Brights 1 option, that actually gives us a good selection. The sky is relatively white and the foreground is quite dark. And the great thing is, this is all done on an InstaMask, so we can still use our slider adjust and change that mask any way we want, just as if we'd created the masks directly in InstaMask. So let's now look at these 5 options: combine, add, subtract, refine and blur. Now blur is quite simple, it just blurs the mask, and some people have used this in the past to stop edging when exposure blending. It's not something that I use, but you might find it useful. Now refine is also not something that I use, but users have particularly asked for it to be in the panel. So I've kept it in there, and it allows us to make changes to our mask. So for example, we can add more contrast to the mask, or we can make the mask smoother, or we can shift any edges in our mask. So there could be some options there that you find useful. But really the more important buttons are combine, add and subtract, and they allow us to combine or subtract any masks that we want. So for example, I could create a Brights 1 mask and I could subtract from it a Darks 1 mask. Or I could create a mask from the RGB masks, let's say a Brights 2 mask, and I could subtract from that the Brights 3 mask from a blue channel. Now this might not make any sense to you, but let me show you how it's useful. Let's go to this image from Dubai, and I want to make a selection of the yellows in the foreground, and I want to combine them with the blues in the sky. So I can go to color mask, and I can select the yellows by clicking on the yellow section, and I can increase the fuzziness. Now another way to do this is to actually create the plus tool, and I can select the sky, but you see it didn't do a great job. Now if we bring down the fuzziness, that does an okay job, but overall I wouldn't be particularly happy with that. So instead what I would do is choose the eyedropper, choose a yellow section of the image, bring up the fuzziness so it's got most of the yellows included, and press OK. Then I press combine, and this creates a mask with our original selection called original. Now I can create a selection of the sky. So I can press color mask, I can select just the sky, and let's increase the fuzziness a little bit, and press OK. Now we have a selection of the sky and the foreground. All I need to do is press add. And now we have a selection of both the yellows and the blues. And to use subtract, I can press combine again. And let's say I want to remove the yellows from that mask. I didn't really like it, so I want to go to color mask again. I can choose the yellows again, make it a nice big selection, press OK. And this time I press subtract. And now I've created that mask without the yellows in the foreground. Now, if you want to see how this is useful in a real workflow, in the top right-hand corner of this video, you're going to see a link. This will take you to a workflow that I did for InstaMask recently, and it will show you about 3/4 of the way through the video how I combine masks or how I subtract masks to make a really good selection of some lavender fields. Now moving on, I'm going to delete this mask and I want to talk about the functions down here. So I'm going to go back to my exposure blending example. And let's say I have this mask here. Now most of these buttons down here are kind of obvious. We have sharpen, so that sharpens the image. We have noise, so that removes noise. Curves layer, a levels layer, saturation and hue layer. So they're all kind of obvious. D and B means dodge and burn. So if I press D and B, we create a dodge and burn layer, and you'll see it's a 50% gray layer. Now all I can do here is choose my brush. Let's choose a black brush at a 30% opacity, and I can paint over this area, and you see we're burning this area. We're making it nice and deep, but we won't affect any areas in the shadows because they're not included in the mask. So we can make fine adjustments based on the masks that we choose. If, however, I want to dodge an area, I can press the white brush option here and I can just paint over that area, and you see we're brightening that area. Now we can't use any of these buttons without an InstaMask being created first. So if I press levels, that won't work. We first have to create an InstaMask, and then I can press levels to create a levels layer. So most of those buttons are obvious, but what about the other buttons? For example, test. Well, if I hide this darker layer and create a mask like we've done before, and I don't know if this mask's going to be any good. So I want to test it on the layer before I apply it. Well, all I need to do for that is choose the layer I want to test the mask on, press test, and you see we've added the mask to that layer, but we still have our InstaMask. So if I show this layer, I can see if that mask looks good or not. And if it doesn't, I can press end test and we go back to our InstaMask, and I can choose a white brush and again, just paint in that area with 100% opacity. Then I can go back to this layer and press test again. And now we've done a much better job of blending those exposures. So if I'm happy, I just press apply. Now, what if you want to use traditional exposure blending with luminosity masks? And that means painting in the selection manually. Well, let me show you how to do that step by step. If we hide our existing darker layer and create our Brights 1 mask, we can then go to select. And now we have an active selection. From there, we can create a black mask on our darker exposure. We can show that exposure. We can choose a white paintbrush, make sure it's large, and then I can press hide ants, and we hide the marching ants. And now I can paint in that darker exposure. And the great thing about painting in luminosity masks is that we can go over the same area multiple times to strengthen it. So we now have a really natural blend. That's before and after. And when we're finished, we can press deselect so we no longer have that active selection. Now these options here are layer opacity. So let's say our blend is relatively natural, but we find that some areas are too dark. Well, I can lower the opacity of the active layer by pressing 40, and that goes to 40%, 50, and I can move along until I find an opacity that I like. Now I actually quite like 100%, so I'm going to leave it at that. And now the final option is live. So I'm going to cancel these windows because we don't need them anymore. So we just have one window open. I'm going to delete this mask and I'm going to create a luminosity mask. Now if I wanted, I can press live. And this gives us a split screen of our image. So we have our color image here in big, and we have our mask on the left here. So we can make adjustments and see how it's affecting the actual layer. So for example, let me open up InstaMask and I go to blended and then I press test. Now I can show that layer, but I can also see just the mask by pressing Alt or Option on a Mac and clicking on the mask. And now if I wanted, I can choose a brush. So if I open up InstaMask and I choose a brush, a white brush, I can paint on the mask to see how it's affecting the layer to the left. So keep watching the layer to the left, and when I take my finger off the mouse button, we see a live example of that exposure blending to see if it works. And if it looks good, of course, we can press apply, and then we've applied that change, and then we can simply close our panel. So those are all of the functions in InstaMask. You're probably going to have to watch this video a few times to remember what they do, and also experiment with the panel to see what works best for you.